Hello, so I'm Dr. Jerry Shannon. I'm chair of the Community Geographies Collaborative, and we're excited today to be hosting our first workshop of spring 2023 on making community geography count. The focus of this discussion is going to be on how do we make community geography legible to the various institutions that we inhabit. I think it can be difficult when you do community engaged work to figure out how to represent it well, particularly in academic institutions that prioritize outputs like major grants, academic peer-reviewed publications, those kinds of very in-house kinds of products. How do we talk about the kinds of goals and products that we get out of community engaged research in ways that help us both translate to some of those academic expectations, but also to help move, transform, shift those academic expectations to be more accepting of those kinds of outcomes as well. So I'm excited about this conversation. As a reminder, this is something that's kind of a two-parter. So our three panelists, whom I'll introduce in a second, have all done short blog posts that are on the CGC website, and we'll post a link to that page here in a second as a way to organize some initial thoughts. And this is a discussion that follows that. So some of the questions will be on things that people posted on those blogs. We're recording this and we'll be posting it up on the CGC website once it's done. Last thing I'll say is we have a second panel already set up during AAG, and it's on public products of community geography research. How do we kind of find ways to publish or make public the work that we do in non-peer-reviewed settings? And our three panelists for that are going to be Kate Derrickson, who's at University of Minnesota, Erin McElroy, who's at, I believe, UT Austin, and also with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and oh man, Rob, and I forget his last name, but he's in the UK and was the key principal investigator for the Land Grab Universities project at High Country News. So I'm really excited about all of those. Bobby Lee, that's his name. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. So we've got three panelists with us today. Dr. Ahmed Allahwala is associate, and feel free if I'm mispronouncing your name, correct me. Associate professor teaching stream in the City Studies program at University of Toronto, Scarborough. He's a community engaged scholar whose work focuses on urban social policy, neighborhood well-being, and community development within the context of the contemporary state and economic restructuring in North America and Western Europe. Dr. Aída Guhlincozzi is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Missouri. Her research interests include health geography, health GIS, race, ethnicity and language, and gender and healthcare. And lastly, Dr. David Padgett is Associate Professor of Geography at Tennessee State University. He has served as Director of the Geographic Information Sciences Laboratory at TSU since 2001. So a great welcome to you all. It's great to have you all here. I've asked them to prepare just a short statement at the beginning to go around and introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how the work they do intersects with the values of community geography. I can pick somebody, or does somebody want to just jump in and go first? Ahmed's already unmuted, so I'm gonna pick on him.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jerry, and lovely. Thank you, Jennifer. Lovely to see you all. Lovely to be here this afternoon or early evening. Hi from Toronto. Thanks for the introduction, Jerry. My appointment is in the City Studies program in the Department of Human Geography, and my way into community geography really is through my teaching practice. I started about 10 years ago to teach a senior undergraduate research seminar on participatory action research, participatory community-based research methods, and it really has morphed into or developed into my laboratory for thinking about community geography in collaboration with students, fellow faculty members, but also obviously the community partners. I work mostly on youth issues, so a lot of my community geography work is dedicated to thinking about issues that young people face in the city with a specific empirical focus here on Toronto, thinking about access to social infrastructure and socially valued goods in the city more generally. I'm not going to talk about the the blog post, but what I think is really interesting to think about for us and why I'm so excited to be on this panel this afternoon, I think we come to community geography with a specific set of values and ethical dispositions, perhaps, and they don't often neatly align with what counts in the academy, or the academy has a really hard time recognizing this type of work. And I organized the blog post around the tensions that emerge between the values and ethics that we bring to this type of work and the policies and procedures that govern our institution. So I'll leave it here, and I look forward to the conversation today. You are muted, Jerry.
Yeah, it's the first one of those. David, do you want to
yes,
introduce
sure.
yourself?
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Dr. David A. Padgett. I'm at Tennessee State University, and TSU is one of our 103 or 4 some odd historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. And I did not begin my career at an HBCU. I didn't attend HBCUs as an undergrad. My parents both did. And so I always had it as, I guess, my end game, so to speak, to be at an HBCU. Upon arrival at Tennessee State University as pretty much a physical geographer, hydrogeologist, and GIS specialist, I arrived at a campus that, like many HBCUs, had no earth science, no GIS to speak of 20 some odd years ago. And so I was already involved in the environmental justice movement per se, but coming to an HBCU, I became immediately aware that our history and position as an academic institution is one that's built to serve our communities, Black communities specifically. So there was never any conflict. As a matter of fact, the expectation is that whatever scholarly work that we do here will serve the community in some capacity. I mean, our motto is think, work, serve. Our charge is enter to learn, leave to serve. So, providing technical assistance to environmental justice communities and looking at the best strategies and engaging in scholarship aimed at how to best do that hasn't been much of a conflict at all. As a matter of fact, it's been, my deans and my president have always lauded the work that we've done in the lab. When I say we, I mean my students and my colleagues. We've been at the forefront of this mission in terms of technical assistance in environmental justice, specifically in geoscience, earth science, and so on and so forth, because those fields are so grossly underrepresented in terms of African Americans. Sub 3% representation in some cases, and yet people in our communities who are facing environmental impacts really look to see people who look like them coming from a technical background to counter the arguments being made or the lies being told by those that would mean to continue to allow polluting facilities to come into their communities. And so last year we formed, my colleagues and I, the HBCU HBCU Environmental Justice Technical Team. And so we are a group of geoscientists and GIS specialists from HBCUs. And our goal is specifically to leverage resources from HBCUs to assist communities that are facing environmental injustice. And so I can talk more about what we're doing with regard to the Justice 40 initiative later.
Thanks. Aída?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I am at the University of Missouri, and part of how I came to community geography is that as I was beginning my research at the University of Illinois as a graduate student, part of what led me to be so passionate and excited about pursuing a graduate degree in geography was a realization in my really at the end of my undergraduate career in geography that I could use my work in geography to contribute to my community and address some of the social issues that I was seeing that were coming about during that time, or at least that had become noticeable to me as a young college student about to embark on the next stage of her life. And community geography became an opportunity to craft an ethos and respond to the ethos that the ethics that were sort of put out by the community geographers that were writing on how to engage with the community, how to be supportive of your communities that you're working with, and do research that was community oriented, but also community led and action oriented. And that was really valuable to me because I knew that I didn't want to replicate any of the harm that the Academy traditionally had provided in the past, especially to the communities that I belong to and was hoping to work with. But I also didn't know what that looked like. And finding out that in geography, there was both a history and potential paths forward for conducting that research in such a way that was valuable was really special. And I used that as I started working on my dissertation work in health geography, focusing on Latina women's access to healthcare in the Chicago suburbs. It's work that I am continuing now, but I also have extended it to incorporate generally vulnerable populations and their access to healthcare, and that encompasses other groups regarding those who are disabled, those who identify in other ways, from whether disability, race, ethnicity, or another social identity, and how they can access healthcare, or how they access healthcare, how the system and structure can be changed to be more supportive of their access to care, and also how we conduct this research in a geographic and GIS way that is feminist and also protective of people's right to privacy, but also is community led and community shared. So I guess that's in brief my work right now and where I'm heading. So I don't have the answers to all of this yet, but
Well, that's highly disappointing. You know, one would expect at this point you'd get it all figured out. So no, this is great. Thank you all for those introductions. To start us off, using maybe Ahmed's blog as a starting point, I think about this idea of the tensions that we feel doing this work within the various academies that we're located in. For the most part, I think all three of you all are in, public universities, right? I'm wondering if you could talk about, like, what are some of the tensions you feel, or where are there places where there's real synergies, where there's like alignment between the goals that you have as someone who's doing community engaged scholarship and the mission of the university, but where are those tensions as well? It's a big question, but see what you can do with it.
Ahmed, do you want to go? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think I hope I'm not doing this too much. The tension that I see is also a place potentially for synergy, or where I've seen some synergy. So the tension is, for me, there's a big push, especially at my university, but in general, I imagine, to get big grants, right? And a lot of the big grant funding or grant institutions that I pursue, like NSF, have purposely incorporated this community engagement component of their grant calls, and saying, like, show us how your work is community engaged, and so on. And the tension there is that, you know, it can become a box, and I have no doubt has and will continue to be, unfortunately, a box that some scholars try to check and just say, I went out and did this and that was it, but it was enough, and it'll be enough, right, in their grant application. However, something that I was pleasantly surprised by is at my university, I've been participating in this grant writing workshop that is like spread out over the course of several months. And it's organized by some of the people in the grants office who are dedicated to assist us with getting grants and being successful in our application. And their framing of the issue around community engagement and making that a part of your grant application is not like, oh, just do this or whatever. They are like, you need to be starting on this now. Start talking to us now about what it is that you want to be doing, because you need to build the connections that are necessary to make this happen. You need to take steps. It needs to start now. It cannot be 2 weeks before submission date. You know, this needs to go like, and I'm not even going to be able to submit for this one grant this year because it just isn't something I can do at my current status, but will be able to do once I transition to tenure track. So when we all realized that recently, they were like, this is even better. We're so glad that you're starting, you know, technically at least a year and a half in advance of even submitting the grant. Because the idea is that I will be building the relationships I need to be building in the long term with the community engaged portion that, which is in this case, an educational component. So it has to be with, you know, some kind of educating of the public. And in my case, it's going to be a camp. If you've read any of my previous work, that's where it's coming from. And so I need to get to know the teachers. I need to make connections with the schools. And they have, like, the grant people that I'm working with, they have connections with people who have connections who can help to plug me in and give me the support I need to be successful. But, you know, they don't want to jeopardize those connections by by just last minute connecting a scholar who didn't give the time and effort that's due in order to do this correctly or with the community's involvement. So you can tell that they don't want to just support scholars by being the rung on the ladder of like, okay, you step on this and you will get to where you need to be, and instead be like, no, we want you to come to us early enough so that way we can sort of evaluate you and your interests and direct you to the right people. And if you're not like where we want you to be in how you think about involving the community, we can have more conversations with you until hopefully you get there. It's a very positive perspective, and I applaud them for it. And I think it's a necessity of their jobs, because their job in the long run is to get anybody who comes to them with a grant idea and interest that grant, because in the long run, the university wants more grants and wants more money. But I do think that these individuals whose job it is not necessarily like to be community geographers, but to be grant support staff. They have to do real work. I mean, we all do, but they have to do real work that can be really thankless. And so if they aren't getting the attention that they need from the scholars the right way, then they have the potential to do things in a different way. I don't know if that was a really vague answer. So
No,
that's just, yeah.
That's good. Yeah, great place to start on this. David or Ahmed, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say that if there's any attention, it's having to make a conscious decision at some point as to whether to be a scholar activist or an activist scholar, and because it's impossible to do both. Yeah, it was a lesson learned. But you know, when I was on the tenure track and soon afterwards. I guess I was more of a scholar activist. I actually would try to be or purposefully be PI on grants and first author, second author on papers and so on and so forth. But the time that it takes to engage in that kind of scholarship it takes a person somewhat away from the grassroots front lines of, in my case, the environmental justice struggle. And so once I got I guess free and comfortable to pretty much call my own shots, so to speak, kind of switched it up. Now I'm more of an activist scholar. And if somebody wants to throw me on a paper as fourth or fifth author, that's okay. If somebody wants to add me on as a consultant on a grant as opposed to a PI, is two totally different levels of responsibility. That's fine. If something is really very, I don't want to say easily attainable, but if there's a proposal or RFP that it appears that we have all the pieces together, then, yeah, I'll put the work in and fill out the forms and do the grants.gov or whatever we need to do now, or who knows, it's always changing. But for the most part, now I like to be in the streets, as they say, right there with the grassroots folks, and on the front lines. And if some scholarly work comes out of that, fine. But that's, not necessarily a priority. But there was a period of time in there where I was really struggling with, which way do I go? But one of my mentors told me that, you have to just find your place in the struggle. I was watching a documentary about the tension between Thurgood Marshall and Dr. Martin Luther King, where, there was tension as to, Thurgood Marshall was like, well, we need to work within the system. We need to, not rabble rouse. And then we saw what Dr. King was doing. He was all about grassroots, being in the streets, grassroots strategy. But at the end of the day, you needed both of them. You needed Marshall in those courtrooms, and you needed Dr. King in the streets for the civil rights movement to really, really work. And so we absolutely need scholars, publishing, grants personship and all of that. But we also need to have some of our scholars just, on the front lines.
If I can jump in, I think these are really important points that have been mentioned. I think one thing is for the university to say that this work is important, and this happens across the board, right? Universities are discovering in many ways community engaged work. Many funding organizations, be that in the US and Canada, are increasingly, as Aída says, sort of requesting community engagement. So I think it's one thing that we hear from the institutions, both the universities and the funders, that this work is important and meaningful. But the other question then is, does and I'm talking from a relatively privileged perspective of a full-time employee of a university, do the tenure and promotions policies then actually adequately capture the amount of work that goes in? So I think that the tension doesn't necessarily exist between the university not embracing this type of work. The question is, do the policies and procedures for career advancement really understand the type of work, and what is the currency that matters at the end of the day? It is interesting to see how there is a growth of these community engagement offices, and folks in the research offices as well, who are supporting this kind of work, as Aída pointed out. But again, what they told you, Aída, is that it takes a long time, and we want you to come in a year and a half in advance before you do it. The question for me is, you know, what's the risk involved for someone who may be precariously employed or who may, you know, come up for tenure a few years down the line, when really what matters at the end of the day is, you know, the publications and the successful grants, because it does take a lot of time to nurture these relationships and be present in the community and be in relation with the partners. So it's a complicated situation that we're navigating, I think, but there are institutional responses, I think. You know, 10-year policies are being reviewed, institutions thinking very carefully about how does public scholarship differ from, you know, quote unquote traditional forms of scholarship, and, you know, how do policies have to address that and respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point around, you know, there's one thing to say universities might discourage this, but it's another thing to say, what do they value and what do they reward? And so they might say like, yeah, this is great. It's great if they get a news story off of it, but like, that's not necessarily a thing that's going to make or break your P&T file. In the same way, that makes sense. Did any of you, like, this time always goes by so quickly, did any of you have questions that have come out of that discussion that you wanted to throw into the mix of three of you all? Or if you're in the audience here, if you want to throw a question in the chat, we can pull from there.
While we're maybe waiting for a question.
Yeah, that's fine. I've got other questions too. I'm just.
Oh,
yeah.
I just thought of, in response to both of the thoughts expressed, I think that's also part of where some of the background toll of being a community geographer and having a scholar activist, or the intent to be a scholar activist or activist scholar, can be high, I guess, because, you know, Ahmed, like, yeah, I totally, like, I agree that a precarious, like, positioned scholar or, you know, member of an institution, is gonna have a hard time keeping to this imagined timeline that you don't know until you know, kind of thing. And it's part of why when I was talking to these folks from my grant office, they were like, you're doing so great, you're like ahead of the game, we're so proud of you, you're so happy. And I was like, that's great, because I've felt behind for the past year and a half, which is since I moved to Columbia, Missouri, because I like hit the ground running in terms of joining my community here and getting to know people and like the activist folks and working with them. And I've been doing things since I started here, but like in terms of specifically getting to know the educational community outside of the university and in the K-12 area, I have had a harder time because, I mean, I don't have a lot of obvious intersections with that community, just because of I'm not a parent, I'm not a student in the K-12, you know, and it's kind of hard, I mean, to sort of justify your positioning there if you don't have like a clear project or something, which I didn't at the time. So there has been, like, I felt relief when they were saying like, good job, you're doing great. But I was also like, I don't know, because like I've been here for a year and a half and I felt like I haven't been doing enough. Like I haven't been making the connections that I need to be making. And I should have started even earlier than now in making the connections that I have made so far. So I think that can be a difficulty of being in with this mindset, is that there's also like a little timer or questioning of yourself of like, are you doing enough? Are you doing it right? Are you doing it with the right amount of time, etc.? And we got questions.
I can read that question. And that's interesting because it's a different perspective than what we had, I think, hinted at earlier, where Claudia was saying, I was curious if any of you have worked in private in private universities. And she said that she knows someone who found it easier to work in a private university than a public university, which is interesting because I guess I would have assumed the latter. I work for a public university. And I know that they talk a lot about making sure that we are this kind of visible contributor to the community. But I guess that would be true for private as well. Does anyone have any experiences or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've had some experiences. One is probably not a fair comparison. I was on the faculty at Oberlin College, which, I mean, it's all about activism and being just out there. Scholarly also, but they definitely weren't holding back on any scholar activism at all. In fact, it was encouraged widely. And so that probably isn't a typical case. But I also spent some time on the faculty at Vanderbilt University, which politically is the polar opposite of Oberlin in every which way. But there are some pockets of progressive thought. I don't want to say pockets. There's a lot of progressive thinkers at Vanderbilt University, and so those who are progressive are very fortunate in that a place like that has just bottomless resources. So some of the things that some of the ideas that we have about working in community or at a public university where we might have to do everything short of having a bake sale or a GoFundMe account, at a place like Vanderbilt or even Oberlin, which is no problem. Just what do you need? So that's the one thing that if there are progressive minds and institutions like that are not just private, but well endowed, a lot can be done. But then even I haven't been on the faculty at Fisk. Fisk University is also in Nashville. It's a small private institution. W.E.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis, John Lewis. There are a list of alumni. It just goes on and on. Beyonce's father graduated from Fisk. He's a Fiskite. A lot of people don't know that. But even, at that institution, which, has had its struggles financially, the faculty members I've collaborated with there, again, have had, are very much encouraged, I guess, because it is an HBCU, to engage in meaningful scholarship, meaningful for community advancement, specifically Black communities. So I don't know. Like it depends upon an individual more at those private institutions in some cases, I think.
Do other folks want to comment on that, or I've got another question we can talk through. Okay, so I think in Ahmed's piece, you also talk about documenting project communication. And I just wanted to open that up. Like, what are ways that the three of you have thought about, like, we talked about this a little bit already, that there's a lot of work that goes on in community engagement that isn't necessarily very legible in terms of, like, everything from just the relational staying in touch with people to doing work that's not really a research work, but is beneficial to the organization as part of maintaining the relationship. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about ways that you've tried to document or represent that kind of work, whether that's communication or otherwise, in ways that are legible to academic institutions, the various ones that y'all are coming from. Ahmed, you want to?
If I can just quickly jump in. Yeah, sure. Sure. If I can just quickly jump in, I think intentional conversations about products in general are very important in community geography and any kind of publicly engaged scholarship. And I'm excited about the panel that you mentioned earlier on, the second panel during the AAG. I think it's legitimate to have conversations with your community partners about the kinds of products that might matter. The community partner may have a clear idea as to what they might need in terms of research output. This could be public education material. This could be flyers, infographics, a website, an archive of some community resources. So they may have a good sense of what would be helpful and advance the goals. But I think it's equally legitimate to engage the community partner in a little bit of translational work. Is like, and here are the things that matter in the academy. And since we are kind of working together, let's see whether we can find synergies between the different products. I did say in my blog post that co-publishing academic articles with community partners is exciting, but it's also quite challenging and sometimes a fairly cumbersome process, just in terms of managing the writing process and making sure that people feel that they have contributed in the way they want it. But I think that's one legitimate goal, that we can invite our community partners to write with us in the formats that we normally communicate our knowledge in, like the academic publication. But I think it's also interesting to think about, okay, what kind of products can we collectively envision that might meet the needs of the community while at the same time being recognizable by the university. So this could be a research website, for instance, or any kind of repository that's publicly available on the internet, for instance, where some research is being housed and that you can then integrate into your portfolio or your dossier as you demonstrate this type of work to the institution and funders. Thanks.
Aída or David, do either of you have thoughts?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate in recent years to find that the community of folks that I've been working with who are very active out here in Colombia are from a mix of backgrounds, including those who are embedded in the university in some way, whether they're like, retired academics or they're staff for the university, or, they're related to a university member in some way. And so they've, in conversations when I am actively helping move something forward, a project forward or something, they'll be like, and can you use this data like for your own, like for a paper, can you do something with this? And I'll be like, yeah, totally. Or I'll be like, this is really not a big deal that I'm doing this thing, and it's okay if I don't get a publication from this, right? So I've just the fact that they have that awareness has been really helpful, and I've been able to communicate with them openly about that. And I think I've never written a paper with a community member, co-author, or multiple. I can't imagine how it could be difficult, just because I have a hard time even writing papers with my own, wonderful colleagues in academia. And so I think also, though, that we can be honest too, that sometimes being an author, a co-author on a research paper is not necessarily the most effective means of communication of a project for like the general community members, and not always, right? And so especially in states or in places where we're facing a sort of like very clear backlash against, informed knowledge, or however you want to put it, basically against, universities, against academic knowledge or any, degrees. I think community members are very clear that like, oh yeah, sometimes you being a university person is going to be great. And sometimes it's better if you're a community member and you just are here because you're part of the general community and you're concerned. And they have, it, and so they don't always need a paper. They don't need a research paper. They need you to use your privilege or experience or whatever to go talk to that city council person and say, by the way, I know about this, and then contribute that knowledge. And or whatever, and however, what is the most effective way for that? Yeah, exactly. And so community members know that, because they know the ways that the research papers and academia in general have or have not contributed to what their causes are, probably more acutely than many of us. And so I think, I don't know, I think there's also just value in being able to say, I'm doing this, and I wrote this in my blog post. So I'm doing this and I'm not going to get a paper from it. And I have to make that up in some other way, and whatever that may mean. So for me, that kind of looks like maybe taking time away from being up at the front. And like, I have like larger communication group chats and stuff and other work that I've done. I'm currently on the board of an activist group here that I have to we have to disclose at our university if we're a part of any potential conflict of interests. And but that shows like leadership. That's something that I can point to at my university and say, yeah, I'm doing this work. And then something else that I do is sometimes I do get pulled in as sort of an expert on certain topics, and I get asked to attend specific city council meetings or city committee meetings on specific issues. And I attend as just as a professor kind of thing. And if I write up a report, or if I analyze any data from those events, I list that on my CV under like public or community writing or engagement, and I write that as a report that I produced, and I put that out on my CV. So I think, and those certainly don't count to my university at the same level at all as a publication or a grant. I do think that kind of documentation is still valuable, especially for the people who are pro this kind of work in my university. They can point to that documentation and say, look at what she's doing. So I think that's one. It's definitely not the perfect, I don't know, put in one-to-one on research papers or grants, but it's still a way to speak to that.
Thanks. David, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just in terms of I guess what counts in terms of scholar activism. I'm sure that as far as a tenure clock or whatever you want to call it, or the dossier building it, we straddle a fine line between what counts and what doesn't, so to speak. And so there are, social media, provides outlets that can instantly be consumed by stakeholders in the general public. I mean, we can put this recording online today. If people in the community can see it, would that count as scholarly presentation? I don't know. It depends upon where you are. And I'm thinking in particular of one infamous case of a scholar activist, African-American female, that all of us in this room may know probably, who was denied tenure at a university at the West Coast. And I'm not going to go into details, but we probably all know exactly who I'm talking about. And so clearly this person was a game changer, so to speak, in terms of geography and ecofeminism and the whole nine. And then to have none of that count, as far as, it was just shocking. And that's not, I can think of two other of my friends who were in the exact same position, who in terms of their place and respect amongst their so-called subjects, if we want to call them that, they were revered, but then within their institutions, it just didn't even matter. And so it's a hard choice to make sometimes, as to where are you going to disseminate your knowledge. And I know I was faced with that years ago. I developed an African American Urban Quality of Life Index. And it was a very specific methodology, and I had a choice of whether to publish it in Urban Geographer or Black Enterprise Magazine. And I published it in Black Enterprise Magazine which has a circulation of 3 million. So, I don't know if Urban Geographer has 3 million circulation, but but fortunately, being at an HBCU, I was able to, put that in my dossier as a relevant body of scholarly work. Now, had I been someplace else, I don't know. That's great. 3 million people read your development of this index, but sorry,
Didn't go through peer review,
Exactly.
But like one of the things I think that does highlight is the importance of the institutions that we're in kind of being open to defining these things, right? Like that's a really, and that can vary, both going back to Claudia's question earlier, that can vary by public and private institutions, like being at an R1 versus being at a teaching university, HBCU versus, original land grant university. Those things vary by institution and how they're valued, it seems like.
If I could, one more thing I was thinking is, and I guess this moves out of our own P&T in some ways, but I do think that teaching our students to be community geographers as well helps to, I guess, make it count. I mean, because especially if we teach courses in the material, because then I think we're making more community geographers and they go out there and change the world, right? That's the ideal. But B, if you're having to submit your syllabi to your course review process at your university, if you have one, or something like that, that can also get the conversation started before you go up for tenure, or as you're, going through that process. That can be valuable too. So I see we have a question. I want to let that.
Yeah, I can read the question. This is from Theodore. I was asking, as a trans person who does trans community research for folks who work in marginalized communities that you're a part of, how do you take care of yourself and avoid burnout? I mean, this is definitely an issue that I've heard of from a lot of community geographers. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I can. We were kind of talking about that a little bit before we started. I can tell you one thing is it's hard to learn how to say no sometimes, even though I'm probably not the best example of that.
We were just talking about that before the session. Saying no is hard.
Yeah. I mean, especially now, because we have with the the Justice 40 money and all these it's just RFA after RFA after RFA for communities. I can't even name them all, from EPA, Department of Energy. And so what happens is when these community-based organizations reach out for technical assistance, our phones ring and ring and ring and ring. And then we have to get on next weekend. Will be the first weekend that I haven't been on a flight this year, just because we want to be there. You want to be there and especially after the last couple of years when we couldn't go anywhere. And it's just night and day to be able to go to Houston and work with my air ambassadors there on a work project I'm working there, or go to Atlanta and work with the communities just face to face. It's just, I don't know, it's energizing. But then, after a while, you have to think, that pesky second law of physics, you just can't get around it, and so sometimes just saying no was one thing. And one thing that I did last year was formed a team, getting like-minded people, realizing that, look, hey, I can't do everything. Recruiting some younger people. Young people have lots of energy and fresh ideas and can do things very quickly. And so, that was another thing, but especially, learning to let go of all the responsibility. I had a friend of mine, in an analogy, I had a friend of mine who was a chef. She opened her own restaurant, but it took so long to get food because she refused to get a sous chef, just refused, because it was her kitchen and nobody's allowed in my kitchen. Finally, she broke down and got some sous chefs, and the restaurant stayed open because it wasn't going to stay open much longer. So I had to get some sous EJ folks, and it's made life a lot easier. And it's tough, to let go of the kind of control freakish ways we academics can be. But, sometimes, hey, you gotta let go and let this person, lay down a base map. Just let them do it, and not want to hover over and be scared that they're going to screw it up. So those are the two things: team building, and sometimes every now and then just saying, hey, I just can't do it this time. Can we do it another time?
I want to be conscious of the time here, and we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes. But as we finish up with this question, one question to think about is that positionality piece in Theodore's question about, like, what's it mean, especially when you're part of that community and experiencing some of the same traumas or difficulties that they are, and how that wears on you. I don't know if any of y'all want to comment on that, particularly Ahmed and Aída, since you haven't spoken yet.
Very briefly, thanks for that question, Theodore. I think, I'm a fairly local community geographer, so I work in the communities surrounding our campus. I don't do work that goes beyond Toronto. So I think part of it comes back to this relationship building, that I have a handful of community partners that I've been working with over the last 10 years, and they know that some years we collaborate, there's a project, and our interests and opportunities align. And then there are other years where, also for personal reasons, we may say, I don't have the bandwidth to do this kind of work. So I think one way of perhaps, mitigating this tension of commitment versus exhaustion is to be in relationships in the long run, and then really establish these relationships of transparency and care, that they can rely on you, maybe not today, but maybe next semester. So negotiating that a little bit and being there in the long run, I think, helps me a lot to not feel guilty or burned out. Thank you.
I just want to echo what everyone else said, and also make the suggestion of being brutally honest with yourself about what you're able to do and give to your community, and that you want to do well, right? Because you can only, give your whole self for something once, basically. Like your whole self, and you don't make it out at the end, right? So think about that, because it's like, if you're doing that every time and you go to a point of burnout, you will no longer be able to contribute. You will no longer be able to be a resource or source of support for your community. And that's not sustainable. But if you want sustainability and change, long-term infrastructural change, which I think a lot of us do because we're geographers, then you have to manage what you give and what you do in those situations, so that way there's still something left for the future, and hopefully more than just something being left, but actually a whole person, who's grown and developed. And so I want to be there and be that person for everyone else, but I know that I can't, and I know that even if I try to the point of exhaustion, there will be a time when I fail, and those people who are depending on me then will not be able to rely on me. And I don't want that. So instead, you have to say, okay, I'm not capable to do that, and that. I can do maybe 2 of these things, and then that needs to get handed off to someone else. And that's where we have to be building the community and community geography, just as everyone else has said. But you have to be brutally honest with yourself about what you are able to contribute, and then be able to say that to other people and say no, not because you're trying to be selfish or because you're too tired or whatever. It's because you are making sure you are not over promising and allowing people to rely on you when they really can't. And that's not about being like mean or rude or whatever or anything. It's about just making sure that they're not putting their weight on you when you'll actually collapse underneath it. So yeah, I think that's my biggest, and that goes for if you identify with the community in a very specific way or not. So yeah.
No, I think that's great. Those are all great. I mean, a lot of this is about boundaries, but boundaries is kind of a superficial way of managing that. But thinking about that question of sustainability seems really key, and boundaries and honesty and being real with one another and recognizing the longevity piece. That all sounds great. I'll say, like, I've been in conversation with several folks at community geography centers recently where we talk a lot about, like, it's not healthy to have one person run the whole thing, to have other people that if you do need to step away for a bit, that other folks can take over if you want to be pursuing a few other questions for a while. I mean, it's different. That's a more outsider perspective than I think the original question was, but it is that question of, like, you're not the center of it necessarily, and being aware of that. Thank you all for this discussion. This was wonderful. I think this was exactly the kind of thing that we were hoping to talk about, and it was great to have audience folks here to ask questions and be part of it as well. So just as a quick reminder, this YouTube will get posted on the same page as is the information, the blogs and all that stuff will be on there. We'll have a transcript of it too that'll get vetted by our panelists. And yeah, just thanks everybody. We're gonna have another panel during AAG. It's gonna be awesome. Keep an eye out for notices on that. So have a good rest of your day and your evening.